The use of CDS by buy and hold investors is discussed in this chapter 3, which also provides a short explanation of what makes these investors use CDS rather than bonds to build a credit portfolio. The list about to appear summarizes some of the principal reasons why a buy and hold investor might prefer CDS over a bond. First, the desired maturity may not be available in the bond market, while in the CDS market it can be whatever the two parties agree upon. Second, the reference entity's bonds may not trade very much, and therefore obtaining them in large size may be nearly impossible. CDS liquidity, on the other hand, often far exceeds that of the underlying bonds, and the aggregate outstanding CDS volume for a reference entity may be a multiple of 10 times or more that of the underlying bonds. Third, the investor is sometimes able to obtain a higher yield in the CDS market than in the bond market without substantial additional risk. This is a critical issue we will be analyzing exhaustively in our module on the CDS cash basis, where it will be especially important to distinguish situations involving market imperfections or technical factors that give rise to this yield advantage of CDS versus cases where the investor is simply assuming greater risks substantively in the CDS market of which he may not be aware. One disadvantage of CDS for a buy and hold investor is that it is classified as a derivative for accounting purposes, which means that any changes in its fair value from period to period must be reported in the income statement. A bond, of course, may be classified under certain specified circumstances in either the available for sale category or in the held to maturity category, either of which normally eliminates the requirement to report through the income statement changes in its fair value. Next, an investor with an unusually high funding cost may often prefer CDS to a bond, assuming the pricing on both is consistent. To illustrate, assume the investor's funding cost stands today at LIBOR plus 2%, that the reference entity's bonds yield LIBOR plus 4%, and that the CDS spread is 4% annualized, of course. Borrowing at LIBOR plus 2% and investing directly in the bonds leaves the investor with 200 basis points of positive carry, while simply selling protection under a CDS appears to leave him with a positive carry of 400 basis points. In fact, this last figure overstates the advantage of the CDS. For the same reasons that the investor's funding cost is high, the protection buyer under the CDS would worry about the investor's ability to honor his obligations under the CDS following a credit event, so would most probably ask for margin as he would with an FX forward, interest rate swap, or many other derivatives. The amount of this margin is not standardized and depends on tenor, quality of counterparty, likelihood of a credit event by the reference entity, and other factors. But let's just assume it is a constant 20% of notional. Our calculation previously of the 4% CDS carry should now be reduced to reflect the cost to the investor of posting this margin. Again, this is complicated somewhat, but at a minimum, it would equal the difference between the rate at which the investor can borrow this margin and the rate he would earn on it under the margin agreement. So presumably this cost is no less than the 200 basis points difference between his borrowing cost and his return on the margin multiplied by the 20% amount of that margin, therefore 40 basis points annually, bringing down the CDS carry from 400 basis points annually to 360 basis points. The implicit leverage described in the last bullet point leads to one last but critical attraction of CDS as compared to bonds. Again, we assume here the investor has $100 to invest, and we assume again the same margin requirement and spreads as before, and try now to evaluate the pros and cons of CDS versus bonds. The calculation of the investor's return on capital under the two alternatives will be shown on worksheet comparison coming up next. On this worksheet, we see the 20% margin assumption for CDS in the cell H6, a LIBOR of 2%, and spreads of 4% for both bonds and CDS directly underneath. We are now ready to derive the ROC, or return on capital, for the investor as follows. In the bond market, the investor simply purchases $100 of the bond, carrying a 6% coupon, and therefore earns $6 annually, which translates, of course, into a 6% return on capital or return on investment. In the CDS market, the investor invests her funds first of $100 in money market instruments yielding LIBOR of 2%. She then pledges this as margin for what can be set to be a $500 position in the CDS market, since only a 20% margin is required, i.e. $100 of margin. And therefore now, assuming no credit event happens, and ignoring accounting issues and thinking only of economics, she would be earning on this 500 4% under the CDS plus another 2%, the LIBOR return, on her money market deposit or investment, bringing all in her yield and ultimately return on capital to 22%, $22 relative to $100, versus only 6% if she had bought the bond. Like any leverage position, of course, the investor would see these attractions rapidly disappear if the margin requirements were to increase over the life of the trade, or of course if a credit event occurred. Let's deal first with the margin requirements and assume, for example, that just before signing up for the CDS contract, the investor's credit rating were downgraded, causing the counterparty to increase this margin requirement of 20% to 40%. Doing so causes the maximum size of the CDS position in cell D7 now to shrink to $250 only. 40% of 250 being the $100 of margin required. And this causes the investor's annual yield to drop to $12, which becomes, of course, a 12% return on her initial capital of $100. And of course, the higher the margin requirement goes, in percentage terms, the closer the CDS and the bond alternative would become in outcome. You might think at this point that the CDS still appears at worst just as good as the bond, and in all other cases superior to it from the perspective of return on capital. But two important observations will quickly dispel this belief. First, if the reference entity experiences a credit event and its bonds are worth only 40% of par as a result, the investor in the bond would lose only $60. Whereas, under the CDS contract, she would be required to pay $500 for the bonds that are delivered to her, and yet that are worth only $200, resulting in a loss for her of $300, or 5 times more than with a simple unleveraged bond investment. Perhaps not surprising, given the 5-to-1 ratio of the size of the two trades. Even absent a credit event involving the reference entity, things can quickly turn nasty with the leveraged CDS alternative. Suppose the reference entity is severely downgraded after the trade is implemented, and that the margining contract between the two parties allows the protection buyer to increase this margin up to 40%. Very similarly to the example we had in the worksheet, the investor must now reduce the size of her position to $250 maximum, which will pull down her return on capital going forward from 22% to 12%. Even further, the reduction of this position means unwinding half the CDS contracts when the reference entity would have widened substantially, and this will cost her large sums of money. Again, we leave for the pricing default swaps module the precise description and calculation of a CDS unwind cost, but remind you to assume that it is close to the duration of the contract times the movement in the spread. In the case of a 200 basis points widening, for example, of the CDS spread on a 5-year contract with duration assumed of, let's say, 4, this would amount to some 8% of the notional amount that is being unwound, or 8% times 250, which is $20. So the investor is required, assuming she has no other cash, to generate the necessary margin to generate the unwind cost from the margin that she has, which therefore drops to 80. And this in turn requires her to reduce her CDS position even further to maintain the 40% margin requirement, which will in turn trigger another loss from the unwinding process, and so on iteratively. As a useful but difficult exercise, you should please confirm that using the above numbers, her CDS position would have to be reduced from the original notional of $500 to the far smaller $187.50. Please click pause while you work on this, and then click play when you are ready to resume. The solution is obtained by setting the following equation first. 100 minus 8% times 500 minus k must equal 40% of k, where k is the CDS notional right after the unwind. The left-hand side of the equation recognizes that the original 100 in money markets that was pledged as margin will need to be reduced by the amount necessary to unwind the CDS, which is the 8% multiplied by the notional being unwound, i.e. 500 minus k. The right-hand side of the equation simply reflects the new margin requirement now at 40% applied to this new notional of k. And of course, the two amounts left and right must be equal. Solving this equation reveals a value of k of 187.50, exactly as predicted. And of course, any further widening in the CDS would eventually bring the remaining notional, k, that the investor is allowed to maintain, even below $100, at which point she is getting a smaller exposure to the reference entity than if she had simply bought the bond. And ultimately, a large enough spread widening of the CDS may wipe out her investment completely when k reaches 0. This completes this short chapter 3.